We are walking through the book of Joshua as a church, and so it has been fun. And so to kind of get you caught up to speed, if you happen to miss last week's message, we are we are going to be in chapter 8 today. But to get you caught up, last week we spent our message in chapter 7, and so this Battle of Ai is kind of a two-part thing, because we we got to the part where Israel got defeated. But how in the world did Israel get defeated? Especially when God says, I've given you the land, go take it. I'll actually push the enemy out before you. You just need to walk in and basically take what I'm giving you. So how in the world does that happen? So following the victory that God gave the people of Israel over Jericho, and as the song says, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. That's exactly what happened. And so following this victory and this miraculous falling of the walls, we read that although God had given very strict orders to his people not to take anything from Jericho, the only exception was Rahab and her family, because she had hid the spots. With them as the exceptions, nothing else was to leave. No one else was to leave Jericho. It was to be completely destroyed. Everything in it. And the only things that they would take would be the things that could not be destroyed, like bronze and iron and all these other things. And so these things that they could not destroy, God was very specific, and he said, take these things and bring them, in essence, to my treasury. And it's not because God needed stuff, because he doesn't need anything. He's not lacking anything. It was because those items were not to be used for common use. They were to be set apart to the Lord, because it was his battle. It was his miracle that caused the walls to come down. Jericho was his win, and so he got the spoils of war. And he pronounced judgment over Jericho, saying, nothing living will last. Everything needs to be destroyed. Everything living needs to be destroyed, and the things you can't destroy, they belong to me. But a man named Achan did not follow those instructions, and he kept some of the plunder for himself. But the crazy didn't stop there. The text reads that Israel then went to this city called Ai to conquer it. And this city gave Israel such a beating that they ran them back to where they came from, and 36 of them died in the process. So Joshua inquires of the Lord as to why God has allowed this. And God clearly states, there's sin in the camp, and you need to remove it from your midst. So Achan and all his possessions, through a process, are identified, then destroyed. And the text says that the Lord turned from his burning anger. That's where we left last week. So that kind of gets you caught up to speed. That's a Cliff Notes version. So we're going to start in Joshua chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. And it says, Then the Lord said to Joshua, Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Take the whole army with you, and go up and attack Ai. For I have delivered into your hands the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. You shall do to Ai as its king and its kings as you did to Jericho and its king, except that you may carry off their plunder and livestock for yourselves. Set an ambush behind the city. Okay, so there's a lot of differences between the story that we read in Joshua. That's pretty cool. Joshua and Jericho put together. No, God gave instructions to Joshua for Jericho, and these instructions are very different. So let's take a look at some of that. First, this first attempt to defeat the city of Ai apparently happened without divine instruction. In fact, chapter 7 reads that the first time Joshua inquires of the Lord or talks to God or seeks counsel or wisdom and guidance is when they had received a beating, and 36 of them fell at the hands of Ai. And so that's when Joshua goes to the Lord. So the first attempt to defeat this city apparently was preceded without divine instruction. So now that Israel's sin had been dealt with specifically Achan, and all he had. God gives Joshua marching orders now for the same city they went out previously for. But in addition to those orders, God's words, "Do not be afraid or discouraged," echo the words in Joshua chapter 1, where the book begins. And God basically says these same words. And he has some other things to say to Joshua in chapter 1, but in essence, don't be afraid or discouraged. And the implication is, for I am with you. Oddly enough, that's what Jesus' final words were before he ascended. Gives the Great Commission, and then he doesn't just end it there, like, go do this. And lo, I am with you to the ends of the age. I love that. It's the same God. Same God. Obviously, Jesus being the Son of God. But same God, same message. Don't be discouraged or dismayed. Go get it. I'm with you. I'm not going to leave you or forsake you. And so to Joshua, there was this implication, an assurance of the Lord's abiding presence. Something that he was not sure that he had when sin was in the camp. The sins of Achan had broken this special relationship God had established with his people. But because their sin had been dealt with the way that God told them to deal with it, Israel has now been forgiven and restored. And so it goes with us. I need to say that to us. We can read these stories, especially Old Testament stuff, and we can feel like so disconnected, or that doesn't apply to us. But the New Testament's so clear. The Old Testament is not to be done away with. Jesus did not come to do away with the Old Testament or the law, the first 5 books. But he didn't come to do away with it or to strike it from the record, but he actually came to fulfill it. The whole Old Testament is about the setup for him. So we can't just read these stories and go, well, that's great, that's good for them, that's a cool story, and then feel disconnected as if there's nothing for us to learn from these stories. So, if special relationship with God is broken by sin with his people, then it still is today. You just need to hear that. I need to hear that, because there's moments when I've honestly lashed out and I've said something, or I've treated someone in a way, or specifically it seems to be more times than not, those closest to me. And I can feel the conviction of the Holy Spirit in that moment that goes, something's not right. My connection with my Heavenly Father is not where it was. And it's not I need to go run away from the Lord and pull a Jonah, but it's I need to come to him. I need to repent. I need to take him up on this invitation for forgiveness of sin, and need to walk in repentance always. And so, as God restores Israel from chapter 7's sin, so can he with you, wherever you're at. I don't care what you've done. I don't care it doesn't matter what you've done. What matters is what he's done. But what else is interesting are the rules that God gives for the plunder. Like, although they were to kill all the inhabitants of Ai, God says they can carry off the plunder and livestock for themselves. This is not what he said at Jericho. In fact, that's the reason Achan had to pay with his life. That's not what God gave as instructions. And so God doesn't do things always the same way every single time. This time he says, take the livestock and plunder for yourselves. And ironically, you can't read chapter 7 without connecting the fact that if Achan could have waited one chapter, he would have got the plunder. He would have got plunder, and it would have been legal plunder. It would have been plunder that could have been his. But instead, he stole from the Lord and paid dearly. Lastly, instead of bringing together the commanders of Israel's army to formulate a strategy, the Lord instead commands Joshua to set up an ambush behind the city. And whereas we're going to read the people of Israel, the majority of the men that were coming against Ai were coming against them on the north side. And there was a valley in between, and God gives instructions for Joshua to take a certain number of them and put an ambush on the western side of Ai. Again, this is not what God told him to do for Jericho. Quite very different. Very different. No marching around, no blowing horns, no shouting. Put together an ambush. Unlike the Battle of Jericho, the divine instructions for defeat of Ai depend less on this miraculous intervention we see at Jericho and more on kind of a strategy, a clever strategy. But the theme that unites both instances, both Jericho and Ai, is that the Lord's instructions are to be heeded. Like, God doesn't waste his words. He just doesn't. If he says something, it's worth listening to, because he doesn't just talk to hear himself bounce off the wall, to hear his voice bounce off the wall. If he says something, it's to be heeded, especially if it's instructions or commands. Verse 3, so Joshua and the whole army moved out to attack Ai. He chose 30,000. First time they actually took 3,000. Again, on their own, they went for this battle with 3,000. But this time, again, verse 3, he chose 30,000 of his best fighting men and sent them out at night with these orders. Listen carefully. You are to set an ambush behind the city. Don't go very far from it. All of you be on alert. I and all those with me will advance on the city. And when the men come out against us, as they did before, we will flee from them. They will pursue us until we have lured them away from the city, for they will say, they are running away from us as they did before. Again, Ai had already chased them back where they come from. So when we flee from them, you are to rise up from ambush and take the city. The Lord your God will give it into your hand. When you have taken the city, set it on fire. Do what the Lord has commanded. See to it, you have my orders. Then Joshua sent them off, and they went to the place of ambush and lay in wait between Bethel and Ai, to the west of Ai. But Joshua spent that night with the people. So Israel here was to depend completely on the Lord for victory. And in contrast to their disobedience in chapter 7, this time Joshua urges obedience to God's command, and the people complied. Verse 10, early the next morning Joshua mustered his army, and he and the leaders of Israel marched before them to Ai. The entire force that was with them marched up and approached the city and arrived in front of it. They set up camp of Ai, north of Ai, with the valley between them and the city. Joshua had taken about 5,000 men and set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai to the west of the city. So the soldiers took up their possessions, with the main camp to the north of the city and the ambush to the west of it. That night Joshua went into the valley. When the king of Ai saw this, he and all the men of the city hurried out early in the morning to meet Israel in battle at a certain place overlooking the Arabah. But he did not know that an ambush had been set against him behind the city. Joshua and all Israel let themselves be driven back before them. They fled toward the wilderness. They had already done this before. Verse 16, all the men of Ai were called to pursue them. And they pursued Joshua and were lured away from the city. Not a man remained in Ai or Bethel who did not go after Israel. They left the city open and went in pursuit of Israel. So remember, this city had easily defeated Israel back in chapter 7. A few things have changed, though, since that last encounter. First, Israel had brought around 8 times more men to the fight. They also had an additional 5,000 that seemed to be waiting in ambush. But maybe the most important detail that's different from this first encounter is that Israel dealt with their sin. They had been forgiven and restored. And this time, because they weren't the first, this time they're walking in obedience to God's words. Verse 18, then the Lord said to Joshua, hold out towards Ai the javelin that is in your hand, for into your hand I will deliver the city. So Joshua held out toward the city the javelin that was in his hand. As soon as he did this, the men in ambush rose quickly from their position and rushed forward. They entered the city and captured it and quickly set it on fire. The men of Ai looked back and saw the smoke of the city rising up into the sky, but they had no chance to escape in any direction. The Israelites who had been fleeing toward the wilderness had turned back against their pursuers. When Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had taken the city and that smoke was going up from it, they turned around and attacked the men of Ai. Those in the ambush also came out of the city against them. so that they were caught in the middle, with Israelites on both sides. Israel cut them down, leaving them neither survivors nor fugitives. But they took the king of Ai alive and brought him to Joshua. If you heard that last sentence and you're like, uh-oh, this is not good. That's not what God asked them to do. Just hold on for a second. The story's not done. Don't feel like we're having a repeat here. But it does, when I read that the first time, I'm like, this is not going to go well. That's not something God told Joshua to do. But nonetheless, let's not get the cart before the horse. But reminiscent of this command that God gave Joshua to hold his javelin up toward the city of Ai is very reminiscent of actually when Moses was wielding the staff of God in his hands in Israel's wilderness battle against the Amalekites. And that's in Exodus 17:9, I believe. And earlier at that same staff had been at the parting of the Red Sea, right? Same staff in Exodus 14:16. But Joshua was instructed by the Lord to hold out the javelin that was in his hand towards Ai. And perhaps this was a signal for the men in ambush to arise and attack the city. Maybe they talked about that pre-battle. But nonetheless, when they saw it, that's when they came out of ambush and took the city and burned it to the ground. But more importantly, this javelin symbolized the Lord giving the city into Joshua's hand. Now, we won't get into the implications as to maybe why Moses was seated and had his hands raised as he's holding the staff, and Aaron and Hur. Not Aaron. Is it Aaron and Hur? Yeah, I believe it's Aaron and Hur. I'm having a mental brain, this morning. But I believe Aaron and Hur are sitting on either side of Moses, keeping his hands raised, because every time his hands came down, the Amalekites started to defeat Israel. So I don't know why Moses needed the help of someone to raise his hands, and Joshua didn't seem to. Maybe it was because one battle took forever, and this one was actually a very quick one. But we do know this, that both times God asked the leader of Israel to raise whatever was in their hand that God had given them. And each time, these things in their hands were a symbol of the power of God. But what's also kind of neat, and maybe this is like a bonus sidebar, and you didn't ask for this, but just a kind of a bonus sidebar, each object that was held into the hand of each of these leaders was a flavor of the kind of leadership that God called each of these men to. Moses is raising the staff. Moses spent time in the desert as a shepherd. And it was the type of leadership that Israel needed coming out of bondage. And Moses was not a military leader. Moses had an incredible education, but that's not why God chose him. In fact, what he was doing right before he went to Egypt was the same thing David had been doing. Shepherding. And I haven't spent a ton of time around sheep, but what I've been told is there are some good things to learn as a shepherd. We know that Jesus is referred to as the good, capital G, capital S, shepherd. And so Israel needed a Moses, shepherd-like leader. And if you didn't read and you haven't read a good account of Moses' leadership, he was very much so the kind of person that would stick his arm around someone and go to God on behalf of them, and was patient. Probably endured way more complaining and stuff that most of us would not have given them a chance. But the staff represented the type of leadership, the type of leader that Moses was, and the type of leader that God raised up to lead Israel in the time they needed a shepherd. But then God changes command. And now Joshua, with a javelin in his hand, is a military figure. And the javelin is obviously a perfect representation of his leadership. He was a military leader. Now, you say, well, which leader was better? That's the wrong question. It's like talking about is Larry Bird or Michael Jordan or LeBron James better. It's like each had their own era, and each are serving in a different time in history. And evidently, they fit the time that God's called them to be in. I'm not talking about basketball anymore. I'm talking about leadership. And so, each of these men were placed by God. Moses and Joshua were very different leaders, but both were exactly what Israel needed in each of these specific times. And so, again, a sidebar, but you and I, we need to be careful in our walk of faith in comparing leaders. And I've been there. I've served some really incredible leaders. I've served some what I would consider to be not so incredible leaders. But I can look back and see that each of us are wired differently, right? We have different personalities, different things that God's put in each of us, different things that we are attracted to because the way God's created us specifically. And because of this, there's going to be leaders that we connect better with. We have people like Caleb that got to see both of their leaderships. And Caleb very well could have been like, I'm not following that guy. He's nothing like Moses. But that's not what Caleb was like. Caleb faithfully served Moses, and then he faithfully served Joshua, and even at an old age was like, give me that mountain. I love that. But he was willing to follow way different leaders. And because we're wired differently, we can have this just natural tendency to want to gravitate towards people that are like us or that maybe have things or qualities to us that are just important, that we connect better with. Maybe we agree with them more, or maybe we just prefer them. And if we're not careful, we can define what a good leader is based upon our preferences and our previous experiences, like Israel could have, rather than who God's placed for such a time as this. But this isn't just like an Israel talk, or we're not talking about something that was. I'm talking about right now. I'm talking about wherever you're at. I don't know where you work. I don't know where you go to school. I don't know. We have people maybe listening to this on another side of the world, and you have a government that's over you that is crazy. This goes for government, for work, for school, for home, at church, anywhere. All leaders, everywhere. God raises up leaders. And so verse 24. When Israel had finished killing all the men of Ai in the fields and in the wilderness where they had chased them, and when every one of them had been put to the sword, all the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. For Joshua did not draw back the hand that held out his javelin until he had destroyed all who lived in Ai. But Israel did carry off for themselves the livestock and plunder of the city, as the Lord had instructed Joshua. That phrase is super key, and it's mentioned many times. As the Lord had instructed Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it a permanent heap of ruins, a desolate place to this day. He impaled the body of the king of Ai on a pole and left it there until evening. At sunset, Joshua ordered them to take the body from the pole and throw it down at the entrance of the city gate, and they raised a large pile of rocks over it, which remains to this day, or to the day that this was written. So, to kind of bring things to a close, I'd love to read from you a passage from the commentary that I've been using. It's been very helpful to me as I've been walking through this study, and it's the New International Biblical Commentary. It's actually got a couple of scholars on this specific commentary. But I love the way they kind of bring this story to a close, and so I want to read that if I may. It's actually on page 58 of this commentary. And so they say, by the power of God, a ruin, Ai, that's what the word Ai means, a ruin becomes a heap, and defeat becomes victory. The heap at Ai celebrates the victory of the Lord and the folly of opposing God. The Bible describes the comparatively insignificant battle of Ai in more detail than the one at Jericho. This is because the lessons learned at the ruin of Ai are more important than the collapse of the walls of Jericho. Defeat at Ai teaches the perils of coveting and disobeying the commands of God, that one should never underestimate the enemy. An ever-present danger demands a total dedication of resources, careful planning, and decisive action by the leader. The heaps of stones can teach every generation that the Lord ultimately provides victory when they eliminate sin and work with God against evil. Together, God and His and obedient followers can conquer any enemy. And so, that's the lesson behind the battle of Ai. And what an incredible example of how God can take a defeat and turn it into victory. And so the God that did that for Israel is still the God we serve today. So, wherever you feel your life is in ruin, wherever you have walked in defeat, God can bring victory. And I believe if we learn the lessons from the battle of Ai, that God will bring victory, whether in this life or the next. And so, to respond today, just to get transparent with you, I've had a horrible job. I've done a horrible job of landing the plane the last couple of weeks. I sit there and I'll have to listen to it over again, which I do encourage. If you ever do public speaking, you should record it and then go back and listen to it. It is humbling. It's not fun to watch yourself speak, but the one thing I've thought is like, land the plane, Ben. So, to not do that today. To respond, I feel like, as a church family, I want to provide an opportunity for us to come together. And so, a couple of things. One, if you're here today and you are in the midst of a ruin or an Ai-like situation, which that's what Ai means, is ruin, or you're walking in defeat, that by the power of God, I believe today that defeat can become a victory. I believe that. God may not change your circumstance or your situation, but He'll change you. But next, if you're here and maybe you're facing a battle and you need God's wisdom, like Joshua did, and you're seeking direction to know, like, how do I lead this family? How do I lead my coworkers or my friends? Or the people the Lord's entrusted to me. Like if He's positioned me, as I believe He has, and you're there facing an enemy, and you are keenly aware you need guidance, a word from the Lord, and His wisdom, that the Lord can guide you to victory. The Lord can guide you as you lead your family, your coworkers, your sphere of influence in victory. And so, what I felt impressed to do or envisioned for our time to respond is that we would literally come together and pray for and with one another. So, if you're watching online, because we're going to turn off the live stream here in a moment as soon as I get done saying this, and you would love prayer, our church family is here, and is if you were to DM in the comments below, or just let us know, hey, would you please pray for this, or would the family of God come together and intercede for me or my family or for someone that I know? If you would write that in the comments below, we will gladly know that we'll be praying with you and for you specifically today. But for the sake of, again, just for those that are here, because most people don't want to get on live television or a live screen, we're going to turn off the camera. But Yeah. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for watching in. And I do believe, and I am believing with you, that God and obedient followers together can conquer the enemy. And he can bring victory where right now we can only see defeat. I do believe that with all my heart.